What's the best way to work with your tax preparer? Well, here to talk with me about that is Jean-Luc Bourdon from Lucent Wealth Planning. Jean-Luc, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
It's a pleasure. So here we are in the middle of tax season. It's quite possible that some clients are still trying to hand stuff over to their tax preparer to get their tax returns prepared. What's the best way to work with a tax preparer?
I think it's really helpful at this point to recognize how busy they are and the challenges that the profession is facing, because the environment has shifted where there's a lot fewer tax preparers. There's we call it the graying of the profession, and the profession is older. I myself starting to feel it, and a lot of tax preparers have been retiring, which is the trend that we saw during COVID, and it's certainly hitting the tax preparation business hard. So it's harder for firms to find younger CPAs or tax preparers. And so recognizing that if you have a really good tax preparer or looking for one, it's more of a challenge than ever before to keep that relationship. And also the tax environment has become more challenging, where the IRS is asking tax preparers to do a lot more. So they have to ask a lot of questions about international accounts. They have to ask a lot of questions about crypto. And so overall, the tax code is never getting easier. And so for each year, tax preparers are increasing their fees to reflect the fact that the job just takes a lot more. So what's really helpful is to recognize then there's a challenge in the profession, and that tax preparers get to be a little choosy because there's a shortage. And so if you have a really good tax preparer, the best way to work with that person is to work in a way as not only to keep that person, but also to be kept. And that's kind of a new mindset, I think, for a lot of clients, to think, well, what can I do to make that other person's job easier, and essentially be on top of their list of their favorite clients, because some tax preparers, unfortunately, separate from clients at the bottom of their list.
Yeah. So you've got the aging and retirement of tax preparers. You've got the increased complexity of a tax return, and then you've got this notion of a client who may or may not be a good client. So what in terms of the business relationship that needs to be formed? What advice do you have there?
I think avoiding the back and forth. So as best as possible, get to the tax preparer with everything ready and organized. The easier it is, the less time it's going to take the tax preparer. The fewer times the tax preparer is going to have to touch the return, essentially, the lower the fee can be. The fee is going to be incremental according to how many times the tax preparer needs to get back to the client and say, well, there's one more thing that's missing, and what about this? And so just facilitating things by being organized and timely, and then getting that information as soon as possible, as soon as it's available. There's no benefit whatsoever to procrastinating. And so getting this as early as possible, so that you don't get to the point where the tax preparer is really stressed out trying to meet the deadline.
Yeah. So I know some tax preparers, perhaps many, use an organizer that they send to their clients at the end of January. And they note in the document that if this is returned to us by March 3rd or whatever the date might be, that we'll probably file your tax return on time. But if not, we'll probably have to file for an extension. Is that somewhat typical?
Yeah, it's very typical, and I would see that date as an ultimatum. I would try to do much better than the ultimatum, because realistically, that's the date a lot of clients are going to keep in mind, and that day is not going to be a fun day for the tax preparer. So being mindful of that is really helpful, and so yeah, facilitating as much as possible.
Yeah. And it strikes me too that given the complexity of tax returns, that that clients may not should not perhaps fear the possibility of having their tax return filed in October instead of April, given that it might give the tax preparer more time to be more thorough, perhaps.
Yes, and I think what I find is some clients have the luxury of going on an extension, and others who expect a large refund, for example, do want this filed as quickly as possible to get that money in their pocket. But also, I would think in general terms, there's a benefit to filing early because filing the tax return is just satisfying the IRS. And sure, there's not a whole lot of motivation in doing that, but there is something in it for us in the sense that once the tax return is prepared, it it gives us homework to gather our financial information that then becomes helpful for tax planning for the following year. So, from my point of view as a tax planner, the sooner we have the information for the current year's tax planning, the better job we can do, if only for estimated tax payments, for example. But other strategies come into play that become helpful to know this.
Yeah. So in terms of being a good client and sort of meeting these deadlines that the tax preparer may have, what advice do you have for the client in terms of how they keep their records? Should they be using Quicken? Should they, make getting documents sent electronically? Just what can they do to sort of improve the process?
That's a great question because some clients are very detail oriented and provide spreadsheets and a lot of details, and there is such a thing as going too far and putting too much effort, doing too good a job. Tax preparers are really well trained at sorting out a mess. So there's the stereotypical shoebox the client brings with all their documents. Well, it's true. Tax preparers have X-ray vision. I could identify a Merrill Lynch statement from a Schwab statement simply by looking at the corner of the form. So tax preparers are really well trained to sort out whatever information you give them. The important thing is to give them everything they ask for. So everything that's mentioned in the tax organizer, every form 1099, any piece of information about deductions, business, all of that. The form doesn't really matter much if you're inclined to using QuickBooks or Quicken, fine, but it's really not the essential.
Talk about you've mentioned in the past this notion of there's an order taker, a salesperson, and an advisor. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I find that when people approach a professional, they usually default to the type of business relationship that they're used to. And there are really three primary business relationships we encounter in daily life. And one is the order taker. We walk to the counter and we say, well, here's what I want. And in that relationship, the more detailed we are, the more we get what we want. And for anybody who's waited in line at Starbucks, we know that some people get really detailed with those orders, and good for them. The other type of business relationships we run into commonly is the salesperson, and in that relationship, that person is giving us our best options among what they provide, but not in the most general sense. We go to a Ford dealer, we don't expect them to tell us about other brands. And so in that relationship, we're best served by information gathering and then comparing and negotiating. But when people approach an advisor, like a health advisor, like a physician, or a wealth advisor, like a CPA or a financial planner, some people default on those relationships, and some people come at us and say, well, here's what I want, thinking we're order takers. Or there's a mistrust that we're not really acting in their best interest. And it's really helpful to recognize that an advisor is someone who looks at the big picture in your best interest. So essentially, they look at your situation through your eyes. They just add technical expertise to the situation. So then the most helpful thing to do, the way we're best served, is by asking really broad questions. The broader the question, the better. If I go to the doctor and say, I don't feel well, my doctor can take it from there. Where does it hurt? And then they will engage us in a thought process to identify the problem, come up with a diagnosis, talk about remedies, solutions, and the pros and cons. And I find that clients who ask the broadest questions come up with the best outcome because then they get all the benefit of the thought process that an advisor provides.
So that seems like a good segue to the kind of due diligence that a client needs to perform.
Yes, because people can only ask really broad questions when they really trust that advisor. You need to have faith in the fact that this person is going to guide you through a process that's really in your best interest. And so trust is certainly a foundation in the process. And to build that trust, I think looking at the person's background is always helpful. I'm always amazed by the the few times that clients really look up the regulatory background of an advisor. So that brings up the point that, well, the person you work with would be licensed. In the tax preparation world, not everybody is licensed. Some states just don't have licensed tax preparers. It's not always a requirement. In my neighborhood, this is the time of year where barbershops hang a sign that says tax preparation, and it serves some simple situations. But if your needs are more elaborate, you really want to work with someone who's properly licensed, and also then you can look up the regulatory record. Are there complaints? Are they current? And so that's the foundation. And I always recommend people to meet a couple of professionals. I think there's always that gut check, that gut feeling that's really important. I always tell clients that the initial conversations will be somewhat comfortable, but we will have more conversations that are less comfortable because life will throw things their way. And I think working with someone that you're comfortable having uncomfortable conversations with about challenges, financial problems, health problems, finding someone that you're comfortable just having that broad conversation with is really helpful. And that's just a matter of gut check.
Yeah. So for many clients, going to a tax pro might seem like a standalone event, but is there a way to get more out of the relationship than just having a client ask a tax preparer to file a tax return?
Yes, so many people use their tax preparer strictly as a transactional situation. They just want it done. They want the IRS out of their lives, and then they can move on. And there's just so much more that could come out of that relationship. So asking the tax preparer, are there any red flags? Sometimes people have situation that's just not looking good, but the tax preparer doesn't really want to make the person uncomfortable. So just opening up the conversation and saying, is there anything in my situation that raises a red flag? Question I love is just to always ask a professional, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Sometimes people are hesitant to give advice because they don't know from that person's point of view what is best. Sometimes things are grayish and they don't want to make a statement assuming the person thinks a certain way. But if you move it to their own situation, then it becomes easier for them to say, well, if it was me, here's what I would do. And sometimes a professional might recommend you one thing, but if you say, what would you do if you were in my shoes, then it might become a different answer. And that's a very interesting question to ask. And then always ending the conversation with, is there anything that I should have asked you but didn't? Sometimes there's something in the back of their mind that they're on the fence. Am I going to bring that up or not? Just might as well push them a little bit to speak up.
Right. And I suppose for many folks, just in general, people want to obviously pay the least amount of taxes that they're legally supposed to pay. Do you find that is the primary motivation, or are there other motivations, I guess, that people need to be thinking about? Is it all about paying the smallest tax bill, or does it go beyond that?
Yeah, it certainly goes beyond that. Certainly, taxpayers should pay every penny they owe, but not one more. But then beyond that, they need to look ahead and optimize their tax situation. A common mistake is try to minimize the current year's tax liability. But if you minimize to this year's tax liability, but end up paying more in the long term, it's not a good equation. So asking long-term questions and looking at the tax planning situation. Preparation is just one element, but it opens up the door then to planning. And it's really important to recognize that in anybody's financial life, the most pervasive aspect of their financial life is tax. And so in every aspect, there's a tax element. And if the tax element can be optimized, in my mind, it's almost like free money. If you can pay less taxes just by thinking of a different way or a strategy, then it's a penny saved is a penny earned.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this notion of not having access to information that could help you not only lower your tax bill this year, but over perhaps your lifetime, whether it's using capital gains, harvesting losses and gains, or whether it's using qualified charitable distribution or whatever it might be. There are tools out there that a client may not be aware of, but you, in your role as tax preparer, Jean-Luc, obviously do know all these tools and techniques.
And the saddest words we hear in practice are coulda, shoulda, would have. And it's really hard at tax preparation time in March or April when clients come in and something could have been done, but the deadline was December 31st and coulda, shoulda, would have. So it's always better to just look at the tax planning situation and see what can be done going forward than to have the yearly appointment to find out what we could have done.
So I'm going to take your advice. I know we've covered a lot of ground, but is there anything else I should have asked or anything else that you should have talked about?
Well, Bob, you're so thorough. No, there is nothing else.
All right, Jean-Luc, it's such a pleasure having you share your knowledge and wisdom with our viewers. Thank you so much.
It was nice talking with you, Bob. Thank you.